Cape Cod Broadcasting weaves the listening environments of 99.9 WQRC, Ocean 104.7, WFCC Classical 107.5, Cape Country 104, and CapeCon.com's website experience to reflect the lifestyles of the people who live, work, and play on Cape Cod. We hope that you enjoy this podcast.
I'm Matt McCarthy, and this is Sunday Journal. My guest this morning is Lieutenant Brian Swintek from the United States Coast Guard. He's here to talk about the activity that the Guard saw this past winter and to look ahead to the warm summer months. Lieutenant, thanks so much for joining us, and happy spring. How good does it feel to say that?
Yeah, no kidding. Thank you very much for having me. We're excited to be able to talk about what the Coast Guard does on the Cape and what our winter looked like, and hopefully what will be a busy but successful summer.
Well, let's start with the winter. Needless to say, this has been a long and difficult winter onshore, and I'm sure that translates for difficult issues for fishermen and others out on the water over the winter months. If you could just maybe talk a little bit about some of the cases that the Coast Guard handled on the water this winter.
Sure. Well, as you're aware, the Coast Guard here in Woods Hole is the parent command for about 12 other units throughout New England that stretch from about south of Plymouth through the Cape and into Rhode Island. And in those duties, we're responsible for tending aids to navigation, and with the colder weather and ice in some harbors, we obviously ran into some issues there. We also are responsible for pollution response, which there's always quite a bit of. And when there's colder weather and ice involved, cleaning up the pollution can be more difficult. And then, of course, we deal with law enforcement and fisheries regulations. And the poor fishermen this year, the weather and the amount of freezing spray we dealt with was really something we haven't seen in quite some time. And then lastly, search and rescue. We had a particularly tough January just in terms of the number of cases we ran and the amount of fatalities that were associated because of those cold water and cold weather. So it was a busy winter, but all in all, a good winter.
So you mentioned a couple of fatalities. How many fatalities did you have on the waters this winter?
Well, so we had 9 fatalities through our area of operation, again, stretching from Rhode Island through Massachusetts. Several of them were people who had decided to commit suicide by jumping off of bridges, and most of those were in Rhode Island. We had 2 cases in the Massachusetts area that garnered quite a bit of attention. One was on December 31st, when we had a 20-year-old male who went kayaking off of West Island. He disappeared, and we later found him several days later deceased. And then probably about a week later, we had 3 duck hunters who were in Westport whose boat capsized, and 2 of the 3 duck hunters passed away. Miraculously, we were able to save one of those 3 duck hunters who really saved himself in that he got on a spit of land and not in the water. And then our helicopter was able to locate him and save him before hypothermia set in.
You mentioned you have a lot of ground to cover. You said you cover all the way from Rhode Island, all throughout the Cape. Does that present a challenge?
Oh, absolutely. It does present a challenge because we also go out to 200 nautical miles in terms of our jurisdiction and authority. But that's, again, where I mentioned those subunits. We have stations placed throughout our AOR so that they can respond to those types of cases. We also have larger Coast Guard cutters that work up and down the East Coast, and depending on the storms, weather, and fisheries that are open, we have different Coast Guard vessels that are in the area to support our operations. And then, of course, we have those aids to navigation teams, and then there's a air station here on Cape Cod, and they support us in support of those missions as well.
And how many substations do you have? I think I'm aware of the one in Chatham. You have one in Provincetown, correct?
Sure. So we have 8 stations. We have one in Provincetown, Chatham. We have one on Nantucket that we call Station Brant Point. We have one on Martha's Vineyard that we call Station Menemsha. We have one in Woods Hole. We have one at Cape Cod Canal. We have one at Watch Hill. We have one in Castle Hill, Rhode Island, and then we have one at Point Judith, Rhode Island as well.
So that really helps you cover all that area.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned the station on Nantucket. That leads into, I guess, one of maybe the bigger things that you had going on this winter. A very large vessel, if I recall, got stranded, about 130 miles off the coast of Nantucket?
Yeah, we did have a large commercial vessel that had some engine troubles, and they were disabled, and they contacted us, and they were about 100 nautical miles out. That presents a particular challenge for us because a vessel that size, they were several hundred feet, isn't a vessel we really have the intrinsic capabilities to tow. So what we did is we monitored the situation with them, made sure that they were safe, made sure that everybody was aware where they were by broadcasting radio transmissions, contacting vessels in their area. We monitored the weather for them, and then they were able to get some ocean-going tugs to come up from New York to tow them to safety. So that was a little bit different mission than we normally deal with, just because usually we can send a Coast Guard asset to go affect the assistance, but in this time we were more just trying to alert others of the potential danger.
So what type of resources do you have available to assist vessels like that? Now, obviously, that was such a large vessel that you said you had to call in some help from New York to help tow such a large vessel in. What type of resources do you have available to help stranded vessels?
Sure, that's a great question, and really, again, I think belies the strength of the Coast Guard in that we have, for your normal type of vessels that we have throughout Cape Cod, that you might own for recreational purposes. Any of those stations I mentioned to you before have multiple small boats at their units. They have 29-foot vessels, 45-foot vessels, and 47-foot vessels that are different sizes and have different capabilities to handle the diverse weather we see here on Cape Cod. Also in Chatham, we have something called the 42-foot vessel that is specially made. There's only 3 in the whole country, and they're all in Chatham.
Wow.
And they're made for the the different bars we have throughout Chatham and the issues they have with as that shifts from every storm.
Issues unique to the Cape.
Absolutely.
Well, and you're exactly right that the Cape is so vast and so different, and especially with the amount of area that you have to cover, certainly some unique challenges can be presented.
Undoubtedly. And then in addition to those small boats, we have some what we call cutters or patrol boats, an 87-foot patrol boat and a 110-foot patrol boat. And we have several of those stationed throughout the East Coast, but in particular, we have 210-footers in Woods Hole, one 87-foot vessel in Woods Hole, and then we have another 87-foot vessel in Newport, Rhode Island. And they obviously, because they're bigger, have bigger engines, they can tow more larger vessels. So typically when we get a fishing vessel that is in distress and needs to be towed, that's who we'll send to go provide assistance. And then we also have 225-foot eights navigation vessels that are out of Newport that do most of the major buoy work you see throughout Cape Cod, and they obviously are bigger, stronger, and can tow more. And so those are most of the assets we have on the water. And then we also, of course, have our helicopters and aircraft out of Air Station Cape Cod, which provide tremendous assistance in either removing people from a distressed vessel or dropping equipment off, such as pumps and radios. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't add what really makes Cape Cod unique, especially in my experience in the Coast Guard, is that the amount of partner agencies we have at the state, local, and federal level who also have boats on the water and expertise and training and knowledge to render assistance. Between the harbor masters, the police departments, the fire departments, the state police, DM, all the different agencies we work with, the National Seashore, they just all have experts for their areas. They all have great assets, and they always work well with their Coast Guard partners so that we can keep the waters as safe as possible.
Well, I think living in Massachusetts, being so coastal and living in coastal Massachusetts, it's ingrained in our culture. So certainly glad that they can help you with that. And quickly with that vessel that got stranded, you were able to tow it into Boston Harbor, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. They brought him into Boston safely, and everybody was okay, and the repairs were effected, and the vessel followed protocol correctly and notified the Coast Guard, and we were able to work through their ship's company to render assistance and also ensure that no further damage was done to the vessel, the crew, or other vessels in the area.
Excellent. We're talking with Lieutenant Brian Swintek. He's from the United States Coast Guard. What type of advice would you give to people about being safe in the water, particularly in the winter and spring as we move away from winter here and the air gets a little warmer, which is nice?
So you just hit my favorite topic because I help operate our 24/7 command center, and a big part of what we do is search and rescue. So more often than not, we're dealing with people who didn't take the appropriate precautions to keep themselves safe. And I would tell you that there's really 3 or 4 major things you can do to help yourself. First is let somebody know where you're going to be going and establish a communications plan with them. And that doesn't have to be anything fancy. That can be just telling your brother, your significant other, whoever, I'm going boating today, I'm leaving from here, I expect to go to this location and be back to the same place I left by 3 o'clock. I will call you when I return. The second thing is having some sort of flotation device. So in the summertime, just a normal life jacket is appropriate and fine, and I would say that you should wear it on your boat. Now, I know that's hard advice to follow sometimes, but I'll tell you that if people are wearing life jackets, we typically can find them and save them. And when you're not wearing a life jacket it's much more difficult to find you, and your time that you can keep yourself afloat is significantly less than a life jacket can keep you afloat. But this time of year, it gets particularly dangerous because as the weather gets warmer, we have to remember the water is still very cold. So like today, for example, we're in the mid-50s, and the water temperature is still low 30s. So your window until hypothermia sets in, depending on your body weight and what you're wearing, it could be less than 2 hours. So that's particularly difficult. So what I would say is, especially for our people going kayaking and are trying to do some more of the on-the-water sports as the spring weather heats up but the water's temperature stays cold, having some sort of dry suit on and, again, a flotation device is critical to your safety. And then the third thing that I would say to everybody is pay attention to the weather. As simple as that sounds, more often than not, the National Weather Service will put up small craft advisories if there's bad weather out, and we broadcast those on multiple marine frequencies. You can find that on a bunch of different websites. But most of our cases that we deal with are because people went out in conditions their vessel couldn't handle or they weren't familiar with. So know your own capabilities, know your vessel's capabilities, wear the proper protection. And again, it's not enough to just be able to have a flotation device. You need to have something that's going to keep you warm. And then lastly, and most importantly as well, is a communications plan. And to touch on that, I would add that whoever you set up that communications plan with, it's always better to call the Coast Guard early rather than late. We ran a case about 2 weeks ago where we got a phone call from a concerned friend who had mentioned to us that he had two friends who had just moved out of their house and were living on a sailboat. They were up near Boston and were planning on sailing down to Newport that day. And again, small craft advisories were up, so we had about 5 to 8 foot seas. Winds were blowing about 30. And they were in a 24-foot sailboat and didn't have a whole lot of sailing experience. They were due to get back to Newport at 6 o'clock at night. They were supposed to leave at 6 in the morning. And they were going to check in with their friend when they arrived. Their friend called us at 6:23 and said, I haven't heard from my friends, and they're not answering their phone. I'm concerned. And they sent us their plan that their friends had given them, which had 54 different points of how they were going to sail from Boston to Newport. We were able to use that information, contact some harbor masters, launch a couple Coast Guard assets, and we ultimately found this vessel safe, not much further south from where they had left, because they decided the sea conditions were beyond their capabilities. So there's a great example of letting people know what your plan is, using your own risk management to determine when the weather's too bad, and then your friend who knows your plan being proactive and calling the Coast Guard. And that ended very well, and that was great for us to see that.
Recently in the news, continuing with the whole search and rescue aspect, one of the biggest stories in the news the past few weeks, is, as I'm sure you're aware, is the missing plane. So I'm curious, what goes into a search and rescue effort from the Coast Guard? Obviously, that particular incident is on such a large scale, it's probably not even close to what you do at the Coast Guard, but overall it is still a search and rescue. And I'm curious what the Coast Guard does on a normal search and rescue mission and how you go about your business.
So there's a couple phases to it. So first is obviously we need to find out if there's somebody in distress. And as soon as we do, we start launching Coast Guard assets and local assets to go render assistance. Where it gets difficult is when we're not sure where that distress is. So for example, about 2 years ago, we had a phone call that came in of a 77-year-old man and a 19-year-old grandson on a sailboat sailing from Centerville to Martha's Vineyard. Again, it was poor sea conditions, winds were blowing, less than a mile of visibility. And they called and reported to us, the 19-year-old son did, that his grandfather had just fallen overboard. So we immediately launch assets, and we're trying to ascertain their position. And we have some great radio equipment that allows us to pinpoint positions using lines of bearing from radio towers. So we're able to get an approximate position where we think the grandfather fell in. And then we have a group of people who are trained back in Woods Hole who go to a month-long school and about a 6-month training program to learn how to run something we called Search and Rescue Optimal Planning System, or SAR-OPS. In the military, we make as many acronyms as we can. It makes job security, right? So using
to make it seem important.
That's right. Absolutely, absolutely. So using this SAR-OPS program, we were what we do is it takes the real-time weather, meaning current and wind, and the predicted weather and wind, and then whatever object you put in there. So whether it's a boat, a person, a couple boats, 2 people, people with life jackets, and it drifts them. And And it drifts this object 10,000 times and gives you a spread of where it could be based off of these things. And then you tell it what you're going to search with and how long you search for. And it tells you the most effective way to do that. And of course, our people who get the training have to make a lot of assumptions about where things could be. So in this case of the 77-year-old grandfather, we had all this information, terrible visibility, terrible weather conditions. We were able to do that detective work, that search and rescue detective work, put it into the computer program, and within 44 minutes we'd picked the grandfather up with mild hypothermia.
Wow, that's fascinating.
So, and another example is we had a case off of Point Judith, Rhode Island, about a summer and a half ago, where a 30-foot boat ran up on the beach with nobody in it. And the boat had been going 30 knots. There was many items in the boat that led us to believe someone had obviously been in there. So we were able to track down the owner of who owned the vessel, who we believed to be on it. And then after about 15 different phone calls to friends and family, we were able to find someone who had fished with this person in the general area we found the boat. So we came up with a rough area we thought this person might be, and we launched helicopters, aircraft, small boats, Coast Guard cutters, harbor masters, fire departments, police departments. We got the report of the vessel at about 6 in the evening, so he probably fell out around 5:30. And we found him swimming at 3:30 in the morning alive in the middle of one of our search and rescue areas. And we're able to pull him out, and he is alive today because of the great work by all the people on scene, but also the research that happens behind the scene to come up with those search patterns.
So sometimes it's just good old-fashioned detective work.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's really the fun part about it. We another great story is we had a dinghy that washed ashore, I want to say, near Martha's Vineyard, and we believed we were trying to figure out who belonged to that vessel, and we were worried someone was in distress. So after much work, we found out who built the boat itself, because it was a locally made type of boat. And through some forms online, we were able to figure out who the CEO of that vessel was by finding their taxes.
Wow.
The CEO of the company that built the vessel, rather. We contacted that person at 3 in the morning. He had a record of all of the boats they had sold, got us the phone number to the person who belonged to that boat, and they weren't answering their phone. So we did some more research on this person, figured out that their home was for sale on Zillow, contacted their real estate agent at 3 in the morning and asked them to try to get a hold of this member.
This really is detective work.
Absolutely. And so, as you can imagine, if your real estate agent calls you about your house that's on the market at 3 in the morning, you're going to answer the phone. And this gentleman answered.
This is a good real estate agent.
Yeah, absolutely. And so he answered his phone and found out that the Coast Guard was looking for him. He called us back and said, "No, I'm not in distress." Went down, verified it was his dinghy, and it had broken free. We were able to close the case out, save unnecessary searching, save the government dollars, save our port partners, the harbor masters, police departments, risk from being out, and also verify, most importantly, that no one was in distress. So very much detective work and kind of behind-the-scenes stuff that is unsung, but a huge part of how we're successful in this multi-layered approach to search and rescue.
Well, unfortunately, we are just about out of time this morning, but Lieutenant Brian Swintek from the U.S. Coast Guard, thank you so much for coming in. We'll have you again as we get closer to the summer months and we get ready for all the summer activity that the Cape would bring, and of course, that should bring activity to the Coast Guard as well, so we will absolutely be in touch, and we'll make sure to talk about what the Coast Guard will have going on as we move closer to the summer. But thank you so much for joining us this morning on Sunday Journal.
Well, thank you very much, and if I could just add, if anyone has questions or concerns or it is an emergency for the Coast Guard, contact 508-457-3211 and we'll point you in the right direction.
Excellent. Lieutenant Brian Swintek from the U.S. Coast Guard, once again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Matt McCarthy, and this is Sunday Journal.
This podcast is a presentation of Cape Cod Broadcasting, which is solely responsible for its content. Thank you for listening. For more information, please visit us at capecodbroadcasting.com.